I also want to say at this stage in the war, this is the first time we see Russian forces face the reality of what it means to take over Ukraine. I mean, the Russians believe that they would be welcomed with flowers. The fact that there are over, 400, 500,000 dead Russian soldiers means that they were greeted by something else. The Ukrainians were not willing to be a part of Russia. The Russians wanted to bring Ruski Mir, which
Yeah.
is, Russian world over. And while there were some people that wanted to join, they realized that the Ukrainians were not going to take this lying down, right? Like from the Russian side, right? You had propaganda that showed, tanks flying the Soviet flag, helicopters that had Na Berlin, which is
Hmm.
like to Berlin,
Yeah.
spray painted on the sides. Soldiers had their dress uniforms as
Oh,
part of their equipment
the,
because they expected to take Kiev so quickly.
there hasn't been any. I haven't seen any evidence from that.
Okay.
I've seen evidence of the riot shields and police units being in the
Mhm.
front lines,
Okay.
well, near the front.
Right.
But the thing I've seen a lot in the initial weeks was the information
Mhm.
war going on and how effective it is to get your message cheaper than pretty much ever before. But again, we can get into that a bit later point.
Yep. So basically, they resisted. And the resistance is seen when the Ukrainians take back two big areas, one, Kherson, and two, the Kharkiv oblasts.
Yeah.
I remember the footage being, you know, when the Ukrainians were liberating the towns, I saw footage of like the Ukrainian people coming out with flowers. So they were lining the streets. Sons were liberating their own towns. They were
Yeah.
greeting their family members. In Kherson, I remember a soldier uh, blasting the Ukrainian anthem, and everybody surrounded him. People were celebrating after the Russians crossed the bridge and left the Kherson. And it was the closest that I've ever seen to the idea of liberation in this war.
Yeah.
The Russians were absolutely caught in the back foot. Not only had they retreated in the early days of the war from the Kiev offensive, but now they're retreating in Kherson, the only major city that they had captured, and they were retreating from the Kharkiv oblasts. This seemed, tell me your thoughts, but like, what do you think about this being the time for Ukraine to either capitalize on the momentum that they had, or this being a good time to sue for peace? Was this an opportunity?
It's hard to tell, even in hindsight, because there's so much we don't know
Mhm.
going what happened on behind the scenes. But the issue is it could have been a potential for negotiations.
Mhm.
But the problem is it negotiations were attempted several times before, and each time they flopped for whichever reason. I forget for right now. But I feel even with some foresight,
Mhm.
it wouldn't have led to anything because there was no reason for either side to negotiate.
Mhm.
Ukraine was running off of a kind of high of victory, rapid land,
Yes.
especially kind of quickly and easily because Russian forces were spread thin and they still weren't structured properly.
Mhm.
They were still kind of operating on initial invasion procedures and such, minimal resistance and all that. And Ukraine just thunder run all the
Yes.
way to the major cities.
Mhm.
The Russians had to pull out, but I don't think it would have led to anything. It's just like with the counteroffensive. Before the counteroffensive,
Okay.
you could argue that there was a potential for negotiations to begin, but Ukraine was not going to do anything without doing their counteroffensive, which is not to be successful. And Russia certainly wasn't going to negotiate as they were going through a period of restructuring their forces.
Okay.
And I guess that's a good way into talking about how the big kind of stalemate period,
Mhm.
slow grinding with Bakhmut,
Yes.
Soledar, and the counteroffensive area in, Zaporizhia direction.
So the counteroffensive, right? It was widely hyped, it came during the summer. As we know now, it maybe wasn't the most successful, taking back very little land at the cost of a lot of soldiers. What would you say, why did the counteroffensive fail? Straight up.
Ukraine's about their own hype. I I feel that's exactly again, like I said, they had just essentially routed the Russian armed forces,
Mhm.
from 40% of land of Ukrainian land held to like 25%,
Mhm.
massive swathes. And They bought into the whole propaganda. The common talking point was that the Russians in the southern area would man the Soviet line,
Mhm,
were there unwillingly, were prepared to fight, and would
mhm,
flee at the first sign of any opposition.
mhm,
And especially at that time too, there was the influx of Western armor and equipment,
mhm,
and for whatever reason, they were overhyped to be as you know s- far superior than whatever Soviet era equipment was present in the field. And people just kind of ignored the reality of the war, where it doesn't matter kind of like how quality your equipment is or how trained your troops are
mhm,
when they're attacking hardened positions
mhm.
that have been built in for the Soviet line was entrenched for 9 months
Right.
with three lines. It was manned with troops. It was prepared. It was it had mined.
Mhm.
And for some reason, that was kind of ignored because people assumed that the Russians would abandon the positions.
I think it's more of the former because you're right. Propaganda is
Yeah,
important for both sides. And obviously, right, like you want to strike fear into the enemy while also boosting morale of your own side. So, of course, the Ukrainians did some of that. But I think it's also more of the second, where, like, we have Western tanks that are fantastic and I do believe more advanced. However, you know, mines don't care how advanced a tank is. The Surovikin line used heavy use of mines. It had anti-tank ditches. I think another reason is at this point the Russians start to shift and they start moving towards total war economy. And what I mean by that is artillery. We thought artillery was a thing of the past, replaced by cruise missiles, replaced by these high-tech helicopters and whatnot. And it is this point when we start to realize that artillery is still king on the
yeah,
battlefield, right? Dropping munitions on people at a low cost per shot. Trenches, right? Like you have all this high tech stuff, but the Surovikin line held. And I know in hindsight, a lot of news sources were sort of saying that instead of attacking along all points along the front, perhaps the Ukrainians should have just focused on one point, D Day style, and just stormed down the middle and concentrated their forces. But in an alternate universe where they chose that path, perhaps that would have failed because they focused on one part, they would have lost other.
yeah.
So I think it is this point that the turning point starts to happen, you know, slowly.
I'll clarify a little bit when buying the hype thing. I also include kind of the whole hype of, I guess we say, mobile warfare, and also again that Western equipment being superior. In some ways, it is, but the problem is kind of like you said, a mine doesn't care what kind of tank rolls over it. It's still a mine. A tank is still a tank.
Yep.
Essentially, it's a box on wheels with a gun. It may have good armor, sure, but it's still gonna get blown up by dedicated anti-tanks. There's a lot of talk, joking, I remember early on, before the war even, like, again, like you said, artillery is obsolete, trenches, who needs that? Everything's gonna be
Mhm,
fast and mobile, and again, everyone just kind of ignored the fact that a guy in a trench is hard to kill,
mhm.
you know? A minefield is hard to cross. It just I mean, I kind of struggle to find words because I'm still kind of baffled by how poorly the what counteroffensive went,
Mhm,
because you kind of go through life with certain assumptions about how the world operates.
mhm,
And times I think sometimes the counteroffensive kind of proves them wrong. But one of the ideas is kind of like you were saying, that whole mass in that location.
mhm,
If you just send enough vehicles or personnel on a single point, then the assumption is that you're gonna get that point. Maybe
mhm,
at heavy loss casualties or such, maybe, or maybe it was minimal, depending on who you're talking to.
mhm,
But you're still gonna fit to take ground.
mhm.
But very little ground was taken with those massive assaults. I mean, we saw the infamous Armor Square,
Bradley Square,
yeah,
I think
Bradley
they call it.
Square had
Yeah.
that one junction and such,
Mhm,
and it was just a mess. And I think it just the Ukrainians fully. I mean, they made trailers for their counteroffensives.
mhm,
You know, going. Don't talk about the offensive happening tomorrow. And we're gonna have a summer party in Crimea.
mhm,
You know, it was advertised, and the big thing is that I believe Ukrainians fell for the big mistake of forgetting that the enemy can adapt too.
The
And
enemy has a vote.
yeah, the enemy has a vote in in your plans. The Russians, voted really hard
Mhm,
when they built defenses and manned it.
mhm,
And the only explanation I have really for why the Ukrainians went full hog for 5 days was that they bought their own hype. And the turning point I feel is it was not even necessarily that first week of the counteroffensive was it the 4 months afterwards where they did the piecemeal attacks
mhm,
with like 5 MRAPs or a platoon of guys
mhm,
every day, on and on and on and on. And they lost a lot of manpower, but it seems like morale as well. Because after the counteroffensive was when we started seeing like morale issues among Ukrainian forces.
mhm,
Off the top of my head, I think is it the 111th, 47th Marines, 3rd Brigade.
mhm.
I mean, I can't think of
Yeah.
it. But it seems, yeah, the counteroffensive was kind of the turning point. It was kind of where the Ukrainians kind of, took a, kind of hit in their capabilities,
Mhm.
and the Russians took a gain in theirs.
Yep.
One kind of the propaganda I saw from the Russian side was kind of like the whole, like, and we were told that NATO armor was superior, that NATO was superior.
Mhm,
And that was just kind of washed. The whole idea of Western equipment being better in the Russian view was kind of washed away with the counteroffensive.
mhm.
Because you just saw, piled up videos of Bradleys and Leopards and such, just wasted. And of all the issues, I think the counteroffensive is Ukraine's biggest flaw.
Okay. So after the counteroffensive, or during around that same time, let's talk about Bakhmut, because I think that was also a very strong turning point in the war. What happened at Bakhmut that changed? Why did Russian fortunes change?
I would say it's really the kind of shift away from Soviet style doctrine in a way,
Mhm,
of where you had a lot more independence in the units.
mhm,
And also, I forgot to say this with the counteroffensive, but it fits with Bakhmut as well. It's interesting that you kind of see a shift, I feel, with Ukrainian and Russian doctrines.
mhm,
Ukraine seems to have kind of shifted more towards, I'd say, let's talk about more Soviet style doctrines, much more top down. While Russia has kind of gone for a more localized organization. We'll see in the end of which one's better for both sides. Yeah, oh, sorry. But I was gonna say because Bakhmut really kind of showed that it's with Prigozhin and Wagner
mhm,
and how they kind of took the city. A lot more independent actions, small unit kind of tactics where squad leaders and platoon leaders had initiatives and were essentially leading the offensive going on in Bakhmut. And I think that's the fact that you start seeing issues with Ukrainian artillery ammunition
mhm.
and the kind of reintroduction of the Russian Air Force is what really started the shift in how the war was going and the loss of Bakhmut and Solodar.